Well, thank you, everyone. I, as you probably notice, probably have one of the more challenging accents, so I will try and speak fairly slow, but quite a broad Scottish accent, unlike my Scottish colleague earlier. I'm from the west of Scotland, so we talk really fast. So I'll try my best. So yeah, as Greg said, I'm going to talk about prevention and mainly talk through a framework around prevention that I think Guernsey could look to adopt. And it's very much based on some of the work we've been doing, looking at whole cities, like the work around London Thrive, but also internationally thinking about the work to develop a public mental health approach, so an approach that builds in prevention and really swims far upstream to try and stop people getting ill in the first place. And we've been looking at that work with some of the 200 thriving cities in the US. So I'll say a bit about the principles behind that as we go. You'll know the figures of 1 in 4 people experiencing mental health problem, and then, of course, there's the more recent survey across the UK that said 1 in 6 people experience mental health problems, really at any one time. Over and above that, we produced a report last year as part of it was this year, as part of Mental Health Awareness Week, which was called Surviving or Thriving, which we didn't know anything about this conference at that point, total coincidence. And we asked people whether or not they were living with positive mental health, and we described that around quality of life and well-being, and only 1 in 6 said that they were, which very much sits with what Greg said this morning about the 17% in Guernsey. And really very alarmingly, when we asked the question of people in that survey, which we carried out with NatSen, so it was a very credible survey, 65% of people felt that they had experienced a mental health problem in their lifetime. Now that's worrying, because that really starts to blow that 1 in 4 figure out the water. And actually, if you consider how many of us stood up when Rachel was talking earlier, then I don't know if it is all that surprising. But what's quite worrying about this piece of work that we did was that over 70% of young people said that they had experienced a mental health problem in their lifetime, and that figure dropped to 60% of older people. So given that older people have lived much longer, they actually should have a higher statistic. So something particular seems to be happening around young people's mental health at the moment that I think we should all be worried about. So this some of you will be familiar with this diagram. It's based on Corey Key's work, which is about the dual spectrum, thinking about going across the way diagonally that you can have mental health symptoms, or you can be well and be symptom-free, and then cutting across that you can have high well-being and low well-being. Now, there's a lot of difficulties and complexity around this, so I'm not saying it's perfect, but to illustrate a point, I think it's quite useful here, because we do know you can have some active symptoms of mental health problems and actually still have a good level of well-being, and you can have very low well-being and actually not have a diagnosable mental health problem. So we'll use it for now. But what I'd like to say about this diagram is that services traditionally, and particularly where we've placed our resources and our efforts, have traditionally been about reducing symptoms, or where possible eradicating symptoms. And if we're really going to move further upstream and try and prevent mental health problems from happening, we really need to start thinking about, oops, there definitely is a problem with this clicker, public mental health interventions that are about improving people's well-being and at the same time looking to improve people's mental health. And to do that, really, from what you've heard from Kate's talk, we really need to start young. So thinking about a life course approach, very much needing to start in childhood, partly because we have got all those opportunities in childhood to intervene. Somebody's always looking after a young child, and that person can do that well or not so well, or contribute to ACEs, actually traumatise the child. So there's a lot can be done around parenting, but also later on around schools, and then, of course, the mental health of mothers themselves. So we've got a bit of a captive audience in children, but also I think the most compelling argument for starting young is that 75% of mental health problems we know are starting to be established by the age of 21. And by the age of 14, that's 50%. So we really do need to get in there young. However, I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that, that's the mental health of future generations, but I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that we don't think about adults either, because adults will be the parents of tomorrow, but also adults, there's new work emerging around adverse life events in adulthood, where people may have been subject to some of those ACEs when they were younger, but then have experienced more when they're adults. So we do need to think about that as well. But I think one of the really good arguments for looking at adults is that they are often the parents. And again, this is just one of many studies where children themselves have said quite clearly to researchers that actually the family dynamics and often the parental relationship has been at the heart of why they've developed a mental health problem. And then I won't say much more because I think that's been covered by a speaker really eloquently this morning about later life and that isolation and loneliness. But we do really need to think about that as well. So what can we do? So acting early is one thing that we can do, but we also need to think about what we do know about the determinants of mental health problems. What puts people at greater risk of developing mental health problems? Why do some people go on to develop them and others don't? And this is very simplistic because there's a lot more complexity, as Kate said, around adverse childhood events for experiences, for instance, and that some people do have protective factors around their lives that make them less likely to develop a mental health problem. But put crudely, there are social factors, adverse childhood experiences, bereavement, isolation. I would also add discrimination to that list. And then, of course, we know the poorer you are, the more likely you are to experience a mental health problem and to have these adverse life experiences clustered. But also, you could be in, you could be doing well in life, have a job, but actually have a job that's causing you a lot of stress and real fear of debt, or actually starting to experience debt. So it's not just poverty. There's a lot of issues around economic factors. Also health factors. If we talked about not artificially separating out mind and body this morning, and I think that's absolutely critical because we know, for instance, if you have a long-term condition, you're as much as at threefold risk of developing a mental health problem. And there are people with, for instance, with disabilities such as learning disabilities at much, much higher risk than the general population. And within thinking about mental health inequalities, the things that put you at higher risk, I wouldn't want to forget about the ecological factors. So protectively, we know that green space, access to places to play, blue space, we heard this morning about water, are really good for your mental health. Equally, unsafe neighbourhoods and a lack of escape space, as they call it, places to go and get away from things, stresses in the home perhaps, neighbourhoods where you don't feel safe to go out at night are all factors that can actually contribute to mental health problems. So what we would suggest is we need to think about the equality of this and think about who's at most at risk, and absolutely do something for everyone, because we don't know 100% who will be at risk tomorrow. We've got a good idea, but we can't completely predict that. But also doing something for everyone, having programmes that actually tackle stigma across the piece, or having school-based programmes or workplace-based programmes that look at the culture for everyone in the workplace. What that can really aptly do is start to reduce the stigma, open the conversation up, and start to normalise the whole topic of mental health, and get people more attuned to talking about how they feel and some of their experiences. But also, we really need to, and we're not doing well here at all, at actually targeting down at not just the people that we know are at higher risk, but also points in people's lives when they're at heightened risk. So points when people are under pressure after bereavement, when they're going through transitions such as retirement, moving from primary school to secondary school. And if we could do one thing, if I could pick one thing to do that's not been mentioned already, it would be around school readiness. It's one of the biggest predictors, is when a child first goes into primary school, leaves nursery, how ready they are to actually learn and socially connect is one of the biggest predictors of how they're going to do around their mental health. So we really need to get tuned in there and do more around that area. And of course, not forgetting people who are in distress, who may have or may not have mental health problems, but might find themselves attending services a lot may have addictions, and people with mental health problems. Oh, sorry, do you want me to go back, Greg? I could quickly go back. Okay. So 2 other concepts, 2 other principles I want to introduce, and one is this whole community, whole place-based. And of course, Guernsey's in an ideal position because you're an island, so you do have this whole place that you could really do something, and you're small enough to be able to do something really quite significant. There's a lot of work going on around city-based work in some of the mega cities because they just, for instance, in England, a lot of work in London, and that's because, and West Midlands, sort of looking at a region, because we know that it's really, it's really got to be broken down. But Guernsey's just about the right size to do something quite significant. And this is a socio-ecological model. And cut short, what it basically is saying is, say that was me in the middle, the days of me being treated by one person and that person just looking at me in isolation has to really be over. We know that most people can't change their lives all on their own, and that their lives are affected by their homes, their families, the communities they live in, those structures and systems that operate around them and often take control of their lives. So factors like whether there's the employment levels, what the benefit system's doing, whether people are able to access good quality housing, and also the outer rings about those public attitudes, stigma and discrimination, the things that really make it difficult for people to actually seek help early, at an early enough point. And then the other concept in this diagram is this model's task shifting, and this is borrowed or stolen, but with their permission, so it's borrowed from New York, and it's really about thinking about all those services that cut across people's lives already, and instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, really thinking about what those services can do. A lot of people have talked about different ways to do that this morning, so I'm not going to reiterate that, but the GPs that work with people, the teachers that work with people, so making every contact count. And then, of course, all those place-based places that people spend their life, whether you spend your life at work or at school. There's lots of places outside the family home that we spend our day. People are captive audiences there, and there's a lot more can be done to improve mental health there. Critically, we need to think about policies that are not mental health specific. If you go back to those determinants, what you'll see very much is a lot of those factors cannot be influenced by mental health policy alone. We need to be thinking about housing policy, criminal justice. And a quick story from my own experience of working as a nurse in a really deprived part of Glasgow. A woman we were seeing who was deeply depressed, who it was very clear had multiple problems in her life. She had 4 children. She was about to have her 5th. After having the baby, she didn't come back to the service. So we went out to see her at home, and we found the most appalling living conditions. Because all her children were the same sex, she was living in a 2-bedroomed, tiny little flat. And the flat actually was subterranean. The landscaping at either side meant there was no daylight and nowhere safe for her children to play. And the most important thing that we did there was work with the housing department to get her rehoused. And 15 years on, to my knowledge, the woman no longer uses services and hasn't since. So thinking about those wider determinants is critical. And also, in doing so, we're not going to achieve all the gains in the mental health landscape. We're not going to save in beds immediately. If you think about children at school, the savings might be around criminal justice. We might see higher levels of attainment. But it will be years before we actually see that work through into savings around beds, for instance, or people receiving longer-term care. So just to think about what that might look like in a school, this diagram is very much focused on the whole school approach. So that takes that look at the culture, at teacher training, at the whole environment, as well as targeting down when children are in greater need and making sure there's peer support services, for example, counselling services, and links through to more specialised services. And I think something very much worth looking at is the work they're doing in Glasgow at the moment around applying nurture as a whole school approach. So what they're looking at is teacher training, but the whole environment, and really, really flipping everything in its head and saying schools are about, first and foremost, they're about nurture and they're about child development, and then the attainment will come. Whether they manage it or not, it's a great aspiration, but fingers crossed, because it could be wonderful if it achieves its goal. And just when we're talking about schools, I think it's just worth noting that if you're thinking about who's most at risk within a school environment, there's something particular going on around girls that we don't know what's going on there at the moment, and there's some studies starting to look at this, but there's higher levels of young girls saying that they're experiencing symptoms of depression. Now, we could have a whole discussion about what that might be about, but I think it's just worth noting. I just wanted to share this with you as one last example of how you could do this whole system-based approach. Royal Mail had approached us to work with them to set up a whole workplace mental health system, mental health improvement system. And what we said was really needs to be about Royal Mail setting up their own mental health improvement arm or embedding it in everything that you do, so that it's about Royal Mail looking after its staff rather than Mental Health Foundation parachuting in. And they've done that really successfully. And actually what was quite surprising is we managed to get people to come forward out the depots, men who often don't disclose, to come forward and make some films for us, which have been really highly successful. I've not got anywhere near enough time to share them with you today, but if you do want to see them, there's a link there below that you can look at. And I'm just going to leave you with this last thought. I think I'm just about in time. We keep doubling down on the things that we know aren't working. We know the current system is dealing with a huge amount of failure demands, that we're not swimming upstream, we're not getting to people early enough, we're not intervening early, and we're not protecting children's mental health. And by doing that, we're finding more and more people flowing through services, and that's getting worse. And the resources are getting more finite, so it's not working. So I want to leave you with this proverb that if we really want to make a difference, prevent mental health problems in the future, and really start to see those prevalence rates start to go in the opposite direction and to go in the right direction, what we really need to do is start thinking about all of us, every one of us, making mental health our business. And that's me. Thank you.